Yevgeny Prigozhin missing, believed dead in an air crash in Russia. Prigozhin led a short-lived rebellion against Vladimir Putin and the Moscow Defense Ministry in June over its handling of the war in Ukraine. His name was on the passenger list of a private jet that came down. At least 10 people confirmed dead. This coming from Russian sources, authorities and the official Russian news agencies. Prigozhin believed killed in an air crash this Wednesday. Thank you very much for joining us here on France 24. Let's bring you the details as they are coming to us here. Reports from Russia that the Wagner mercenary commander Yevgeny Prigozhin was on board an aircraft that crashed, killing all on board. The flight was a business jet. 10 people are reported dead. 8 bodies have been found at the scene of this crash. Prigozhin's name was on the passenger list of the flight, according to Russian media, quoting the Russian Civil Aviation Authority, and it's believed that the jet in question was actually owned by Prigozhin himself. It was Prigozhin who led the rebellion against Vladimir Putin in June when his mercenaries marched on Moscow. There have been long-standing rows over the supply of arms, ammunition and personnel, which put Prigozhin more and more at odds with the Russian military establishment, and his online outbursts against the system as he saw it included criticism of his supposed friend and ally Vladimir Putin. The rebellion was called off actually no sooner than it started, but it was an act that still sends shockwaves across Russia and leaves many questions about what is happening in the higher echelons of authority in Moscow. There is still no official or even unconfirmed news about Prigozhin's whereabouts or whether he's been injured or killed in this air crash. However, from official sources, if we can believe what they are saying, Prigozhin is on that jet and there are no survivors in the crash. We will bring you all the analysis of this news, which is coming to us here at France 24, with reaction from across the international perspective. We start there with our international affairs commentator, Douglas Herbert, here in the studio. Douglas, some people will not be surprised to hear that Yevgeny Prigozhin is believed dead in this crash.
Especially if you're Russian watching this news tonight. On official sources, a lot of Russians have become numb to their toxic propaganda from their state news outlets. And even though it's often their only source of information, especially for an older generation of Russians, they've also become very cynical about their news. And for a large part of the Russian population watching this, they're simply not going to buy any Kremlin line that suggests that this was merely an accident under investigation now, as it is by the Russian Civil Aviation Agency, the Emergency Ministry, that they've officially opened an investigation for a violation of air traffic safety rules. They're going to think, given the precedent of what's happened in the past, that something is up, some sort of foul play. Now, that said, you're right to be, we have to be as journalists, right? We are duty-bound to be cautious here. We're duty-bound to put the question mark on that caption our viewers can see on the screen. We can't take away that question mark because however much it's easy to simply dismiss the possibility that this was just an accident, it's still there. I will note that there is a Telegram account relatively close to the Kremlin. You see, by the way, Yevgeny Prigozhin.
As you're talking, we're showing that image of
from yesterday.
Prigozhin just from yesterday.
This is yesterday. He was believed to be in Africa, but at an unknown location. And that was a video that he posted in which he is apparently recruiting new fighters to join the Wagner Group in Africa. No longer in Ukraine. They've pulled out of Ukraine, right? That episode, that chapter is over. Page is turned, but he was in Africa. So this was sort of a new phase that he was rolling out in the recruitment of new fighters in Ukraine. But as I was saying before, the note of caution injected into this, it's very easy tonight to say, yes, Yevgeny Prigozhin, obviously foul play. He was on that plane. He must be dead. There are some notes of caution being injected. There is a site on Telegram. It's called Uryadovka. It's close to Russian authorities, and they are saying tonight it is premature to just categorically assume that Yevgeny Prigozhin was on that plane. Now, that might seem unlikely that he would not have been on that plane. But I will also note, just to add a twist of confusion to all of this, there was a second Embraer jet, a second private business jet, also owned by or under the name of Yevgeny Prigozhin and his Wagner Group, that landed in Moscow, I believe, shortly after this plane crash. So there were two jets out there, right? One which crashed, and another business jet under Yevgeny Prigozhin's name, which landed in Moscow, leaving open the possibility of speculation, well, maybe Prigozhin was on that other business jet. But to offset that type of speculation, and there are any number of theories swirling, and none of them have been verified to date, some other accounts, relatively reliable ones on Telegram also, and most of the information, anything that's vaguely reliable about Russia right now, you'll find on Telegram, not on the official propaganda outlets, have been reporting that people close to Prigozhin, perhaps his friends, his relatives, who have been trying to reach him in the past hour or so, have been unable to reach him. And another account belonging to Ksenia Sobchak, who is generally, she's a journalistic figure, a talk show host, also a personality in Russia, who's also believed to be sort of close to Putin, paradoxically, so has his blessing and can say and do what she wants, but is seen as a very reliable, independent reporter and journalist. She's also reporting that, according to her sources, Prigozhin was on that plane. Once again, I say that with that note of caution, that it is not categorical. We've not been able to confirm it. We haven't been able to verify it. There's still the possibility he wasn't. But given the precedent in Russia, given what we've seen so far, given what we've heard tonight, I would say it's unlikely that he was not on that plane.
Douglas, for now, thank you very much indeed. Do stay with us. Let's bring in Emmanuel Shaz, who's waiting for us in Kyiv. Emmanuel, our correspondent there, covering the conflict in Ukraine. Thank you for being with us, Emmanuel. Prigozhin, very much a person who has blood on his hands on both sides, clearly responsible for the deaths of many Ukrainian soldiers, but also for many of his own fighters.
Absolutely. Well, actually, Yevgeny Prigozhin had heavily criticized the Russian command of the Russian forces and Vladimir Putin for losing so many of his own men in Russia's aggression against Ukraine. He many times criticized the Kremlin for saying that the Kremlin was not being completely careless about Wagner, the Wagner Group's losses in Ukraine. But at the same time, here in Ukraine, people will remember Yevgeny Prigozhin and remember him still as a very cruel warlord. This is how he's seen here. So there's very little sympathy. There's even if his death is confirmed, he's despised here. He's hated here. And I'd like to bring you a poll that was launched tonight in the wake of this news by the state media United 24, asking to the Ukrainian population, what do you think happened today? And 63% of the respondents say that it was an operation from Russia's special services. So a majority of Ukrainians think that this was an action conducted by Russian intelligence. There's 20% of them who are still in doubt. They don't really know what happens. 15% think it's a cover-up story, but the theory that is widely accepted is that of an action from Russian intelligence, and it is actually what was said by the head of Ukrainian intelligence, Kirill Budanov, right after Yevgeny Prigozhin had started a rebellion against the Kremlin in June. Kirill Budanov had said on June 30th that the Russian intelligence would now look to eliminate Yevgeny Prigozhin, and if should his death be confirmed, this would be the theory that is widely believed in here in Ukraine.
Indeed. And given, Emmanuel, the involvement that Prigozhin and his Wagner Group had in Bakhmut and the number of lives that were lost there, one can really imagine that there will be no tears shed at all among Ukrainians about this passing of Prigozhin, his death, if indeed it is confirmed.
Absolutely not. There will be no sympathy for Yevgeny Prigozhin. There was some cheering here in Ukraine back in June when Prigozhin started his rebellion against the Kremlin, but not as a means of support to Prigozhin, more because if there is internal turmoil in Russia, well, this necessarily helps Ukrainians in their counteroffensive. It helps them when they see that the Russian system is disrupted from from the inside. So there was cheering when they heard about the rebellion, but there's definitely no sympathy for Prigozhin, given all the crimes he committed here in Ukraine and that he actually openly spoke about. He was saying time and again that his mercenaries were being violent and being cruel, and he justified that by using the Russian propaganda rhetoric on Ukrainians being Nazis and similar theories. And now that he is presumed dead, there will be no sympathy for him, especially not here in Ukraine among the population, but also not in the army, because as you mentioned, Bakhmut was one of the places where the mercenaries of Wagner, they suffered heavy losses, but they've also inflicted very heavy losses to the Ukrainian army, and with an intense display of cruelty as well. So no tears shed from Kiev and in Ukraine in general should Prigozhin's death be confirmed.
Emmanuel, you're speaking to us from Kiev, but you have reported from the front line and you'll be going back there, I know, at some point to carry on your work. Give us a sense of the scale of the damage that you've seen there. And clearly the Wagner mercenaries have been right at the heart of that, obviously with Prigozhin pulling all the strings. Tell us more about the damage that's been caused, the human damage, the structural damage, the destruction that you've witnessed.
Well, the scale is appalling. The cities like Bakhmut, like Chasiv Yar, which often make the news because they're being shelled, they've been shelled for over a year and a half, and there's literally nothing left from those cities. There's like maybe 10-15% of the population still remaining because they have nowhere else to go. Those are places where you see, the grey of the buildings that have been transformed into dust. You see the blood of the soldiers. I've been in a start point, spent a day in a start point very near Chasiv Yar, where you see waves and waves of wounded soldiers coming there. There's loss of life on a daily basis there, and there's also constant shelling from Russia on Ukraine cities there. So it's a very, very dire situation, not just on the positions on point zero where combat is taking place, but in the entire region of Donetsk where I have been. There are scenes of devastation. There are also some cities that have been relatively spared, but the closer you get to the front line, the more you see the extent of the damage that has been inflicted by the Russian troops.
Indeed, and this means the lives of millions of people, Emmanuel, some that you've met, of course, have been badly affected, impacted by this operation. And clearly, you've mentioned the scale of what happens. What about the human cost? Tell us a little bit more about that, the sort of stories that you've come across.
Well, for example, I've been spending quite a lot of time in Kramatorsk, which is not exactly on the front line, but only minutes away with the car. It's a place which the mayors told me was in a highly possible combat military action zone. So not on the front line yet, but this could happen anytime. Kramatorsk was under heavy pressure before the successful Ukrainian counteroffensive in September. Then the pressure was released a little bit, but you can see that the streets there are mostly empty. You can see a population of locals which stayed because they have elderly relatives that cannot move, or people with a disability who are staying there, or simply families of servicemen, families of first responders, families of soldiers, and of course you have soldiers who come here directly from the front line, and often the soldiers that you see are no longer, you can see that they've seen so much and they've experienced so much that they barely look like humans anymore. So the front line is definitely a place where you can see that life is lost on a daily basis, not just for people who die there, but also people who will live with the PTSD for the rest of their lives, or who will live to tell about the horrors they've seen there and they've witnessed there.
Indeed, and the man at the centre of all that, Yevgeny Prigozhin. Emmanuel, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. Please do stay with us. Emmanuel Shaz, our correspondent in Kyiv. Let's bring in for more analysis of this story as it's developing, and just to remind you what we have so far in terms of confirmed news from authorities in Russia and from Russian official news sources such as TASS. Yevgeny Prigozhin on board a flight. His name was on the list of passengers on board a private jet believed to be owned by him, which crashed on a flight from Moscow to St. Petersburg. We understand there are no survivors on this flight. We're waiting for total confirmation that Prigozhin is dead, but it looks like from various sources this is the case. Let's bring in Samuel Romani from the Royal United Services Institute, Associate Fellow there. Samuel, thanks for joining us. Great to see you as always, and it's always good to get your analysis of the situation. A human being has died, and that's nothing to celebrate, clearly. But there will be many people who will not be sad to learn that someone like Yevgeny Prigozhin has died. So I'll put that to one side. What do you think happens next in terms of this whole situation? Because clearly the head of the Wagner mercenaries, it now seems is taken out of the game. What do you think happens next?
Well, it seems to be just more than just the head of the Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prigozhin. There also seems to be some of his closest associates, including Dmitry Utkin, who founded the Wagner Group back in 2014 from the Slavonic Corps and played a pivotal role in their operations from the beginning in Luhansk and Syria, and then on to Rostov when they stormed onto Moscow. So this seems to be an elimination of not just Prigozhin, but most of the Wagner leadership. And it remains to be seen how the Wagner Group can function or reconstitute itself in this scenario.
What do you think has happened, Samuel? I'll ask you very, very bluntly. Do you think this is something that is a deliberate act, or do you think it is an accident?
Well, I think it is most likely to be speculation about it being a deliberate act, given what Kirill Budanov was saying in Ukraine, and given the fact that it occurred just 2 months after the mutiny. And also, it seems as if air defense missiles fired on the jet. That seems to be the report coming through from the Gray Zone Telegram channel. And that could be accidental, but given the fact that there have been histories of malfunctions with air defense missiles and obviously friendly fire against Russian jets being reported in the past, with manpads in particular. But given the given who it is, this was just an accident.
Clearly, a number of theories there, Samuel, and obviously all of them go towards the end of Putin getting his revenge. Is that what we're really looking at, do you think?
I think we probably are looking at Putin getting his revenge 2 months later. And it was belated revenge because it did appear as if Prigozhin was partially rehabilitated. He was at the Trezin Hotel in St. Petersburg, his hotel that he owns, with African leaders just a few weeks ago. Just yesterday, he was in Mali talking about how the Wagner Group was going to expand and play a critical role in fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other militants in that area. But this coincided also with the final confirmation of the dismissal of the Russian Aerospace Forces chief, General Sergei Surovikin, right after the Luna 25 moon landing. Surovikin, of course, was a close friend of Prigozhin and now a card-carrying member of the Wagner Group. So I think that this is part of a broader purge of ultranationalists inside Russia. Even Prigozhin's enemies within the ultranationalist camp, like MH17 perpetrator Igor Girkin, are also being cracked down on. Girkin is currently in jail.
So in terms of what happens next, Samuel, clearly something is moving in Moscow. Which way is it going?
Well, I think this is an aim at deterring another insurrection like what we saw happen in Rostov and then on to the outskirts of Moscow back in June, happening again before the March 2024 presidential elections, and also during the Ukrainian counteroffensive. So if the Ukrainian counteroffensive does not result in major territorial gains, and if this act of coercion is sufficient to deter ultranationalists from instigating unrest, Putin will be reelected seamlessly, and the political stability of Russia will be secure in the short term. So I think that that's really what this is all about, making sure that Russia is politically stable and secure through any means ahead of the elections.
One wonders what ordinary Russians think about all of this, Samuel, given that, of course, they rely on state media mostly for their information, but increasingly, of course, they have access to sources like the internet, Telegram, those kind of applications to find out what else is going on. How do you feel this is playing amongst Russians on the streets who are looking for the information from different sources?
So what we saw is that even though Prigozhin was denounced as a traitor by Putin and by so many of the Russian state media and Russian officials, he still had a grassroots amount of popularity amongst people who are frustrated by how the war is going, the cost of the war, and also amongst ultranationalists. So I think that he'll be mourned by a sizable sector of the Russian population who share those views. And what we're seeing so far, then, in the controlled media spaces of state TV and Telegram are not harsh denunciations of his legacy or reminders of the mutiny. Most of them are talking about how he stood up to the West in Africa, and the West got back at him. They're decrying this as an act of terrorism. Igor Korotchenko, the popular defense analyst in Russia One, said that Wagner became the second biggest brand in Russia after Kalashnikov. So the Russian state media is commemorating him and treating him with respect and not condemning him. And that's probably because there's a lot of sympathy for him, and there'll be a lot of mourners for him amongst the ultranationalist camp if his death is confirmed.
There are many questions, Samuel, aren't there? You mentioned there quite astutely about Wagner becoming the second biggest brand behind Kalashnikov in Russia. Clearly, this Wagner brand is there. These mercenaries are there. What do you think happens next with them?
Well, I think it remains to be seen exactly how the Wagner Group can reconstitute itself without Prigozhin, without other members of the senior leadership like Utkin. Prigozhin knows not just the battle plans of the Wagner Group, he also knows the sanctions evasion routes. He's got personal linkages in the gold trade to banks and financial institutions across the world and shell companies. How much of that knowledge has been given to other Russian officials, or how much of that knowledge was kept close to his chest as some kind of an insurance policy? The answers to those questions will determine how Wagner will reconstitute and finance itself. It's possible there could be a leader emerging from within who wasn't killed in the crash, like Deputy Defense Minister Mikhail Mizintsev, the butcher of Mariupol. Somebody like that could emerge as a leader, or somebody more pliable and close to Shoigu, like Andrei Troshev, who Putin wanted to promote. But whether they'll be able to rally patriotism or inspire morale within Wagner or secure those financial routes, which are very important, that remains to be seen in a post-Prigozhin Wagner.
Indeed, those financial routes you're talking about, I mean, clearly being involved in Ukraine is not making Wagner any money, and by extension of that, making Russia any money. But Wagner's involvement in African states clearly is. And I imagine that that is something that is going to be maintained, if not developed, in spite of the obvious change of leadership that will now happen at the head of Wagner.
Absolutely. I mean, there's still going to be the Russian gold company in Sudan that's going to be taking gold directly into the Russian central bank. We saw yesterday the Russian deputy defense minister meet with Khalifa Haftar in Libya to discuss the future of their involvement there. I think this is the Libyan National Army is now doing direct deals with the defense ministry instead of Wagner. Maybe the Mali junta, maybe Central African Republic will follow suit. We'll keep gold in the flowing to be answered now.
Samuel Romani of the Royal United Services Institute, thank you for now very much indeed for joining us and giving us your analysis of the situation. We always appreciate it. Samuel Romani, thank you. If you're just joining us, the news coming out of Russia is that Yevgeny Prigozhin was on board a flight which crashed with no survivors. We understand that his life has been lost. Prigozhin, of course, just to remind you, was the head of the Wagner Group. He led a rebellion against Vladimir Putin and the Russian Defense Ministry back in June over the handling of the war in Ukraine. That situation, of course, raised many questions about what was actually going on within Russia and led to some questions about whether or not this was a direct challenge to Vladimir Putin's leadership. In all, the rebellion lasted for around about 24 hours, but it certainly moved the earth under the feet of the major Russian leadership players, and speculation began as to what would happen to Prigozhin immediately after that. Some are seeing what is happening now as a possible revenge from Vladimir Putin. Others being more circumspect and waiting to sort of have further confirmation about what actually happened to the aircraft to make it crash. But we don't yet know for certain that Prigozhin is actually dead. However, all the information is stacking up to say the same thing, that he was on board the flight and there are no survivors. Let's give you some reaction from around the world, and let's very pertinently start in Ukraine, where the Wagner Group was heavily involved around Bakhmut in particular, in what became known as the meat grinder, which is a horrific image to consider when you think about the number of fighters and soldiers who lost their lives there, and many of them, of course, were part of the Wagner Group. Mikhailo Podolyak, Ukraine's presidential advisor, speaking via social media, said, "It's obvious that Putin does not forgive anyone for his own bestial terror. The demonstrative elimination of Prigozhin and the Wagner command 2 months after the coup attempt is a signal from Putin to Russia's elites ahead of the 2024 elections. Beware, disloyalty equals death," he went on to say. So definitely that coming from Ukrainian sources, that they believe that this was a hit at Putin's request to get rid of Prigozhin. We cannot confirm or deny that, but this is how the story is beginning to pan out. Joe Biden from the United States said to be not surprised, that's a direct quotation, by news of Prigozhin's possible death. And then the quotation goes on, "There is not that much that happens in Russia that Putin is not behind." The words of Joe Biden on this, we presume, death of Prigozhin. Let's listen then to the US president.
I don't know for a fact what happened, but I'm not surprised.
Do you believe Putin is behind this, sir?
There's not much that happens in Russia with Putin on it, but I don't know enough to know the answer.
Joe Biden speaking just a few moments ago regarding the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin. Here in the studio, we've got Douglas Herbert, our international affairs commentator. Doug, thanks for staying with us. We're joined by Cyril Bayan, our roving reporter, who has reported not only in Ukraine, but also widely in Africa. And a lot of what you've done in terms of reporting, Cyril, has touched on the work of Prigozhin, the presence of Wagner in different areas. And especially in Africa, you've witnessed the impact of the Wagner mercenaries there. Tell us a bit more about that and how perhaps you think this could change with the death of Prigozhin.
Well, it will be very much indeed some consequences regarding the magnitude of the event with regards of the influence of the Russian influence with using Wagner people and Yevgeny Prigozhin. A few days ago, he posted on the social media this video on the 21st of August saying, "I'm somewhere in Africa with his full gear, paramilitary, and his gun. So where is it? We don't know. It was not totally confirmed." But it looked very much that the Yevgeny Prigozhin, 2 months after his coup de force, his mutiny against the Kremlin, when his people have been advancing towards the Russian capital with no people stopping them, and even people applauding them. And at some point, we thought really this Prigozhin was totally out of the radar, and it will be down as a emerging, very important people of influence around Putin. After this mutiny, there were 3 scenarios regarding the influence of Yevgeny Prigozhin in Africa. Was Wagner will stay with him. It was really impossible at this point because we really thought this thing, which if it's confirmed, will happen to him after what he did. I recall that Putin called him a traitor on national TV. So one scenario was this, which was merely impossible. The other one was Wagner continuing his role of influence without Yevgeny Prigozhin. Very impossible because he really incarnates the rise of Wagner influence in countries like Libya, like Central Africa, Mali, of course, and why not also Niger. This is what we can talk a bit later. But the third scenario was maybe the paradigm will stay with the same way of expanding, but not with Wagner. Vladimir Putin has been asking to many people in his circles to create. I'm thinking about Gazprom, for instance, the billionaire which is in charge of Gazprom, to create some paramilitary units in the same way that Wagner started his work a few years ago. So there are dozens of other look like Wagner in Russia with a very minor size, minor influence. But it was the scenario who was, according to experts on the field, military experts, a possibility. Afterwards, we've seen that Wagner was trying to go after Bakhmut in what he have been fighting for months in Bakhmut, which also showed the rise of Yevgeny Prigozhin to go in Belarus, and then he disappeared. Then happened the St. Petersburg summit, Africa summit, which just by coincidence, and history will tell what a very terrible coincidence, just a few days, one day after the coup in Niger, the 26th of July, where he reappeared in a picture with some African leaders from Central Africa and just welcoming the coup and saying with this very colorful way of talking, I salute, I welcome this coup in Niger just to get rid of the colonial powers, namely France, and to welcome the new strategy of expanding the relationship. Just quoting by memory what he said, the relationship between Russia and Africa. So it looks like he was re-emerging, rising again. And this video on the 21st of August, so a few days ago, some people are saying he was maybe back from Africa when his jet, if it's confirmed, was gunned down, crashed a few hours ago, was maybe one of the scenarios that he was reconcentrating with the go from Vladimir Putin in Africa, where what he did worked very, very well in terms of influence, strategy, but also in this information war of using very, very small means for years and years, very in advance with regards of what the French or the American have been doing, using some trolls, some very, very, with a few, not something that cost too much, but it was maybe the rise again of him having a go to reconcentrate his means in Africa.
Cyril, we'll come back to you about Niger in a moment, and obviously the involvement of Russia, perhaps or not. Because clearly, Russia's saying they support the coup wholeheartedly there, and you're just back from Niger. Let's bring in Douglas to talk a little bit more about that Russian influence that has gone across Africa, and the importance and the role that Wagner's played in that, and obviously Prigozhin right at the center of that too.
And a role which perhaps, a lot of people will perhaps see a role which would have become more prominent now that Wagner has ostensibly withdrawn from Ukraine, whatever, tacit deal may have been struck between the authorities in the Kremlin and the Wagner Group. We obviously don't know the specifics, probably won't know the specifics, but it was clear that he was entering a new phase there. And the video that Cyril was just talking about obviously was hardly a video of a man on the run, was hardly the video of a man who felt that perhaps his days were numbered. Although I would contend that he was savvy enough to know, because let's remember, he has been a longtime associate, even though they become arch adversaries. He was a longtime associate of Vladimir Putin. His career started out, he built his fortune by winning lucrative catering contracts and construction contracts, becoming dubbed the chef.
It's amazing to imagine
Kremlin
that
chef.
He starts like that, isn't it?
But he knew from the inside how the Kremlin operated, but more specifically, he knew how Putin thought. And that is why I say that even while he may have thought that he had enough influence, that he had enough cover, he probably also knew that he was not invulnerable. And perhaps that can help explain why he seemed to be, and I have to use the word seemed to be, because it's all a matter of interpretation, pushing the envelope on the level of his audacity, right? This was a man who was known for spewing vulgarities. He was known for being coarse and crude to the point of caricature. And yet he kept going, and he kept upping the ante, so to speak. A lot of people would say, okay, you survived narrowly that mutiny. You somehow got away with it with your life intact. Now shut up and disappear. He didn't. And perhaps that was, in a sense, he was doing it because he knew he was going for broke. He had nothing to lose. He perhaps thought that obviously he was going to be a target, even if he thought that maybe he would have a little bit more time out there. So I think he was a savvy man, and he wasn't stupid. And he knew that obviously he knows how Russia works. He knows how the Kremlin works. He knows how these people think. So while it is still obviously speculation to say that he was knocked off by whatever, based on the past precedent, based on what we see in Russia, where oligarchs who criticize Putin conveniently fall off balconies, conveniently jump out windows at just the right moment. There's always a deniability, obviously, from the Kremlin. To this day, the Kremlin has never acknowledged any role in the shooting down of the Malaysian airliner over Ukraine about almost a decade ago. To this day, the Kremlin absolutely categorically denies any role, implicit or not so implicit, in the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, what happened there. No matter how this pans out, no matter what an investigation now underway by the Russian Civil Aviation Authority and by the Russian Emergency Ministry, whatever their conclusions may be, whatever they bear out, even if they do conclude it was an accident from the so-called PVO, which is the Russian Air Defense Forces, which is one of the theories, plausible. Even if that happens, there will always be plausible deniability or absolute deniability from the Kremlin. They will never say, they will never admit, no matter what any investigation, especially an international one, concludes, that Yevgeny Prigozhin's plane was shot down or otherwise brought down by foul play from the Kremlin. That is not in the realm of possibilities in how this is going to play out.
Douglas, bear with us. Cyril, we'll get you back to you in a second. Let's bring you the head of the CIA Director Bill Burns. He has something to say which I think chimes with what Douglas was just saying there. He predicted last month that the Wagner mercenary leader Yevgeny Prigozhin probably hadn't seen the last of Vladimir Putin's wrath after the warlord staged that failed coup against the Kremlin. Let's take a listen to the director of the CIA.
Putin is someone who generally thinks that revenge is a dish best served cold. So he's going to try to settle the situation to the extent he can. But again, in my experience, Putin is the ultimate apostle of payback. So I would be surprised if Prigozhin escapes further retribution for this. So in that sense, the president's right. If I were Prigozhin, I wouldn't fire my food taster.
Aspen Securities Forum, that's several weeks ago. That was Bill Burns almost predicting what has happened here. In some people's points of view, of course, the exact circumstances remain to be confirmed. But Doug, it's kind of chiming with what you were saying.
I will just say, look, the pattern has been, since the mutiny now exactly 2 months ago, the aborted mutiny, has been one of Putin reconsolidating his power, essentially sending a message to all Russians or anyone inclined to cross their messages with the Kremlin, to oppose, to challenge the Kremlin line. Has been nothing to see here. Move on. I think Cyril.
Finish.
Have something.
Finish what you're saying, Douglas, please.
No, nothing to see here. Move on. He has been trying to basically consolidate his power to show that he is very much. You remember that period of questioning in the days and even weeks following the mutiny, the immediate aftermath. Is Putin weakened? Is Putin now more vulnerable? Does he have enemies within? Is the Kremlin fragmented and divided? Does he have people plotting to stab him in the back? This is Putin very clearly saying no. All of those messages are absolutely bogus. That is Western spin. I am very much in control. And by the way, anyone who dares to cross me, watch out. He's obviously not owning this. He's not ever going to say that he has, chosen to take out another big adversary. But the basic message is, and the message elites are going to get, regardless of what the actual circumstances behind this were, the message that the elites in Russia are going to get, or anyone out there who is sort of hedging their bets, sitting on the fence, waiting to see how things play out with Vladimir Putin, perhaps hoping for his demise, but not daring to say so. Those people now have a very clear message. You don't cross Putin. He is in control right now, and you do cross him at your own peril.
Douglas, thank you. Cyril Pye, I'm bringing you back in. You've reported extensively on issues in Mali, currently Niger as well. You're just back in our studios from reporting on that. I mean, clearly we've seen, and you've charted for us the extent of Russian, we say interference. On the other side of that, you might say Russian help. I don't know. It depends which side of the fence you're on and how you look at these things. But in terms of Russia's influence in Africa, what are the changes that you charted? What are the changes that you'd noticed? I mean, clearly there's a real hostility in former French colonies regarding French attitudes, regarding French soldiers being present, possibly even regarding French media being present.
Right. I would just use the last event, which was the 26th of July coup in Niger, which was the one of last countries, democratic countries, and stable, I would say, country, which has been extremely the French, but also the Americans, security-wise, we are really counting on this country. The speech of the military leaders in Niger with this very surprising coup, the international community was totally surprised by what happened, and it's still going on, less than a few days before 1 month now, is the change in the speech. The coup leaders, after a few days, went to Mali, neighboring Mali, went to Burkina Faso, and we saw the speech of what they were saying on national TV, and namely the anti-French and pro-Africa discourse paradigm was extremely pregnant, was extremely prominent. And we could see the Russians, this is a way to answer your question, because I think the Russians have been also surprised by this coup. People were commenting that the Russians organized the thing in the shadow. Nobody believes that, because it was more a mutiny from a General Chani, the president of the guard, was not happy about something, and it turned to be a coup d'etat. But the Russian, and namely Wagner, are extremely good in surfing opportunistically to an event and taking it to their advantage. So after, my point is, we had some round of delegations going in and out of Niamey, Bamako, and Ouagadougou, and then Guinea. So all the brotherhood of putschists in this part of Africa, and the speech changed. Very anti-French, very pro-Africa. And then it turned to be no way back. It was irreversible in this matter. And we really could see some influence from the people who just give some element of speeches to these African leaders with, namely, this what have been doing Wagner in countries before. So it looks very much as the same paradigm, and it was maybe the end of the very vulnerable, indeed, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was just playing his life and trying to be in the front of the game again.
Indeed, and of course, it's consequential amounts of money for Russia too being taken off as well. Cyril, thank you for that for now. Let's bring in David Smith in Washington. David Smith, of course, is the bureau chief of the Guardian newspaper, joining us live. David, thanks for being with us. We've heard from Joe Biden saying that not much goes on in Russia that Putin doesn't know about. Is that the sense you're getting from whispers around the corridors of power where you are in Washington?
Yes, I think so. In recent weeks, we heard Joe Biden making a sort of tongue-in-cheek comment about, if I was Prigozhin, I'd be checking my menu and what I eat. And Bill Burns, the head of the CIA, made a similar comment as well at a security forum recently. So I think with millions of other people, the US government certainly had a suspicion that Prigozhin might become a target for Vladimir Putin. And yes, just in the last hour or two, Joe Biden, who's on holiday in Nevada, was asked specifically about what has happened and said about comments, confirming he doesn't actually know himself yet, of course. Confirmation of this, but would not be surprised, as you say, that nothing really happens in Russia without Vladimir Putin being behind it. So I think right now the White House is obviously watching this closely, and would not at all be surprised if it turns out Vladimir Putin's hand is in this, given so many incidents in the past when Putin's enemies have met with their demise.
Indeed, there is a pattern. We've been discussing that in the studio here, David. But just talking about the US angle again, I mean, the US intelligence was very much ahead of the curve in terms of predicting the invasion back in February last year when that happened. Do you get any whispers from intelligence sources about what might have happened here with Prigozhin, about what might happen next, about how things could develop in Moscow and beyond?
I think hard to say, and you're absolutely right. The US has often been ahead of the game on this. I was just at a press conference earlier where the Democrats were reminding us that US intelligence predicted the Russian invasion even when President Zelensky of Ukraine was still saying it was not going to happen. So I would not at all be surprised if US intelligence sort of foresaw something like this happening. We're hearing in American media, former intelligence directors and figures in that establishment now speculating that, of course, this is Putin trying to reassert control, trying to send a very direct message that any rebellion against him will be quelled. But also what those experts are saying, and what I suspect the current US intelligence community is watching closely, is now the morale of Russian forces. Remember, Prigozhin and the Wagner Group were fighting alongside the conventional Russian army in Ukraine. That has been a steep struggle, and now to see what has happened to the Wagner Group could be a blow to morale and an army that in many cases does not want to be there anyway. Developments of recent months suggest that what could appear like a stalemate that's not going anywhere, get sudden developments and things can change very quickly. So I think the US remains braced for that, and in the meantime, determined to not be the one to blink first, determined to keep on pumping security assistance to Ukraine.
David Smith, Washington Bureau Chief of the Guardian newspaper. Thank you so very much indeed for that analysis. Just to remind people, Joe Biden saying that nothing happens in Russia without Putin's knowledge. And the news, of course, that we're bringing you in this breaking news bulletin is that an air crash has happened in Russia the name of Yevgeny Prigozhin of the Wagner Group on the list of passengers in that aircraft. So he is now currently missing, presumed dead. Official Russian sources, that's authorities, that's the official news service TASS, is reporting it as such. We, of course, are awaiting full confirmation, but that's the story as we can tell it to you right now. Thank you to Douglas Herbert, our International Affairs Editor. Thank you to Cyril Payan, our international reporter as well. Thank you both for joining us. Thanks to all our correspondents and guests who joined us for this bulletin. Stay with us. We'll have much more on this on France 24 coming up.
(1966), an unbelievable story that's been largely forgotten. Above the village of Palomares in Spain, 2 US Air Force planes collide. One of them is a nuclear bomber. On board, 4 atomic bombs. None are armed and they do not explode. But 2 are cracked open on impact with the ground, creating a plutonium leak, posing a risk to health and threatening the ecosystem. While the 3rd bomb remains intact, the missing 4th bomb is found at sea after a tense 89-day search. Hear the moving testimonies of locals in search of answers and experts denouncing the lack of transparency on the part of the government and the US military. Palomares Revisited on France 24 and France24.com. They observe. They contact us. They report, film, photograph. They are the voice of the voiceless. Your eyes in the far-flung reaches of the world. The Observers, a network of 5,000 committed citizens working with France 24.
One of our observers in Côte d'Ivoire, Gaspard.
Amateur footage and testimonials checked by our journalists and broadcast weekly. On The Observers, on France 24 and observers.france24.com.
Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, the Russian warlord who had been courting African nations, turning away from their traditional colonial allies, may be dead. Yevgeny Prigozhin is the head of Wagner mercenary operations, who number in their thousands in countries like Central African Republic, Mali and Sudan across Africa. He's reportedly killed in a plane crash near Moscow. Also, a chaotic day at the polls in Zimbabwe leads opposition leader Nelson Chamisa to cry foul, alleging voter suppression as he goes up against incumbent Emerson Mnangagwa, hoping to shake his ZANU-PF party's decades-long hold. And the BRICS Club is willing to build itself up. The group of emerging economies meeting at a key summit in Johannesburg agrees to expand its membership. But first, on Tuesday, the boss of Russian mercenary group Wagner posted his first online video since late June when he staged a short-lived rebellion against Russian President Vladimir Putin. In the video, Yevgeny Prigozhin appeared to be in Africa, which he claimed Wagner was helping make more free. A day later, news broke that his name was on the list of passengers on a plane that went down near Moscow. It's not thought to have had any survivors. Now, thousands of Wagner troops operate in several countries across Africa, including Central African Republic, Libya and Mali. Even the recent junta in Niger may have been putting out feelers towards the group. Now, Wagner had been an unofficial extension of the Kremlin's reach, but that relationship was complicated by the uprising against Putin. And now Prigozhin may have passed on. Well, Dr. Fola Aina from the security think tank, the Royal United Services, joins me now with more. Doctor, first of all, what do you think that Prigozhin's potential exit might mean for Wagner's operations in Africa?
Thank you very much for having me. First of all, I think it doesn't make so much of a difference because in many ways, Wagner has been able to establish its presence across the region, the continent. So I feel basically that what's going to happen right now is simply to get a replacement for him. And then the group's basically its operations continues basically in Africa uninterrupted.
And post-uprising, can the African influence of the Kremlin and that of Wagner still really be seen as one and the same? Is this likely to change much when it comes to Putin's interactions with Africa?
Again, so I think we shouldn't expect so much to change with regards to this interaction with Africa. First and foremost is because Russia has a very keen interest in Africa right now, and with what's been happening with the West and the region or on the continent, there's a keen need for Russia to try to fill in the policing gap, that has been created as a result of the West's declining influence across the African continent. So if at all anything, I would say that we'd be seeing more of an inroad by Russia across the region, and whether or not Russia will be using Wagner Group to achieve this would be much to be desired or much to be seen, basically, for Russia. But it's certain that they would definitely continue to make this inroads across the continent, and in many ways also try to assure, that their interest in Africa is guaranteed and secured.
And when it comes to Wagner itself, just give us a bit of a sense of what its footprint looks like on the continent at the moment.
So yes, Wagner has been very much entrenched in Africa, and they've been making lots of plans to try to expand this reach. So currently they have a presence in Mali, in the Central African Republic, also in Burkina Faso, and like you rightly mentioned, also there were already plans to get involved in Niger, considering the recent developments in that country. But now I think what they'll be trying to do is to go ahead with these penetration into the African continent and expand upon some of the gains they've already made on the continent, irrespective of the fact that their leader has passed on.
Thank you so much for your insight, Dr. Fola Aina, there, security expert from the Royal United Services. Now, in other news, Zimbabwe's main opposition leaders accused incumbent President Emmerson Mnangagwa's government of vote rigging after huge delays at polling booths during Wednesday's high-stakes elections. Voting stations were still being opened in some places as others closed for the day. Shirley Sitbin tells us more.
These voters arrived to their polling stations hours before they were due to open, but they discovered that their ballots had not been printed. Some voters' names were also missing from the official registers.
But I'm going to sleep here. I'm not going home. Home is going to come here because I want to cast my vote. My children are suffering. No employment, no education. We cannot afford it.
Is it professional? So at the end, we as the citizens of Zimbabwe, we are not going to trust the result which is going to come out, especially if it's favoring the incumbent.
The incumbent president, 80-year-old Emmerson Mnangagwa, is facing once again Nelson Chamisa, 45, from the Citizens Coalition for Change. Chamisa said voting delays were a deliberate attempt to alter results.
And a deliberate plot. They are targeting urban areas. They've made sure that there are no ballots for the councillors. There are no ballots for other candidates.
NGOs have accused authorities of blocking opposition rallies and campaigns. Asked if he had a message for the nation, President Mnangagwa replied,
Peace and violence.
Emmerson Mnangagwa hailed the high turnout among young voters.
Well, Nyasha Chingono is in Harare and joins us now. Now, Nyasha, we saw Nelson Chamisa there saying that it's voter suppression. We saw on the eve of the vote of Zimbabwe, the US expressing concern about political violence and coercion in this election. Do you think that it was foreseeable that the exercise wouldn't go smoothly?
Thank you so much for having me. I think the writing was on the wall that ZEC was not ready to hold this election. Before, about 2 weeks ago, it was taken to court by the main opposition party for 3 reasons: that it had not revealed who had printed the ballot papers. Number 2, how many ballot papers had been printed, and also number 3, that were they ready to disperse these. So the writing was on the wall that the Electoral Commission was not prepared to run this election. We saw it today. Many people right now are still voting as late as 9 p.m. Voting in some police stations started as late as 7 p.m. So it's actually a worrying sight. It's the first of its kind in this country that the Electoral Commission has failed to provide the basic requirements of running a credible election.
And Nyasha, Nelson Chamisa is trying to break ZANU-PF's grip on power. Mnangagwa is trying to run for a second term. What are the overall stakes here?
For the incumbent, this election and its credibility is very important for the reason that Zimbabwe is owing nearly 18 billion to the multilateral institutions. And as part of the conditions that for debt resolution to take place, Zimbabwe is supposed to hold a free, fair and credible election. So he cannot afford to let this slip through his hands. He has to make sure that this election is run fairly. And also, this is his second and last term. He needs to get this vote so that he can also instill confidence in the people that put him into power back in 2017. For Nelson Chamisa, it's a do or die for him. If he does not win this election, it means that another 5 years of Zimbabwe under ZANU-PF rule, which will extend it to about 48 years in power. So it's something that is the ball is in the two men's court that they need to make sure that they win this election for the generality of Zimbabwe, so that life can change for the poor person on the street.
Thank you so much, Nyasha Chingono, there for speaking to us from Harare. Now, leaders of the group of emerging economies known as BRICS, made up of Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, for now, have agreed to expand their membership. Calls to enlarge the BRICS have dominated conversations at a summit in Johannesburg. Some of its members would like to boost its weight as a potential geopolitical counterbalance to Western powers. Erin Bates tells us more.
AU Chairperson Azali Assoumani, as well as UN Secretary-General António Guterres, are among delegates at the 15th BRICS summit held here in Johannesburg, South Africa, on the African continent for the first time. Of course, Assoumani's presence is important because of the appetite amongst African countries, among them Zimbabwe. We've also heard reports about Algeria and the Democratic Republic of Congo to join the BRICS bloc. Of course, Guterres' press conference, which is set to take place after two meetings he's been invited to attend on Thursday, the 24th of August, will be important because there's been so much discussion about putting a balance to the prevailing world order. In fact, during the addresses from the five heads of state on Wednesday afternoon, we heard commentary on the need for bodies like the UN Security Council to have stronger African representation and indeed permanent representation. You could say that the sirens have been sounding from delegates here at the 15th BRICS summit in terms of expanding membership. There's consensus from leaders on that score. The question now is what will be the criterion and indeed the impact of growing the group.
Erin Bates there for us in Johannesburg. That is, though, where we'll have to leave it now for Eye on Africa. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Till then, take care. Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith.
All the latest in politics, economics and the arts in Africa on France 24. Our journalists are in every region, every country, to report on the emergence of a continent of unparalleled riches. Bringing you Africa's stories on France 24.
Good, thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.
Liberté, égalité, actualité. On France 24, watch exclusive interviews with the world's most influential personalities.
We need to act together because we're protecting our freedom.
Encounters with key political leaders.
L'inquiétude, elle est extrême.
Leading figures from the worlds of culture, sport and science.
La science, la recherche, la découverte, le progrès, c'est important, c'est pas des mots qui sont vides.
Whatever you think is right, you can do.
Watch The Interview, a meeting of ideas on France 24 and France24.com.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Yevgeny Prigozhin missing, believed dead in an air crash in Russia. Prigozhin led a short-lived rebellion against Vladimir Putin and the Moscow Defense Ministry back in June over the handling of the war in Ukraine. His name was on the passenger list of a private jet that came down. At least 10 confirmed dead there. The sources are Russian authorities and the Russian news service TASS. Our correspondent Manuel Shaz is standing by in Kyiv for reaction from the Ukrainian side. Of course, Prigozhin and Wagner heavily implicated in much of the death and destruction caused in the east of Ukraine. Thank you for joining us. Reports coming in from Russia that the Wagner mercenary commander Yevgeny Prigozhin was on board an aircraft that crashed, killing all on board. The flight was a business jet. 10 people are reported dead. 8 bodies have been found at the scene of the crash in the Tver region in between Moscow and St. Petersburg. Prigozhin's name was on the passenger list of the flight, according to Russian media, quoting the Russian Civil Aviation Authority. Prigozhin led the rebellion against Putin back in June when his mercenaries marched on Moscow. There have been long-standing rows over the supply of arms, ammunition and personnel, which put Prigozhin more and more at odds with the Russian military establishment. And his online outbursts against the system, as he saw it, included criticism of his supposed friend and ally, Vladimir Putin. The rebellion was soon called off, but it was an act that sent shockwaves across Russia, and questions are still being asked about what actually happened and what the implications might be. And one of the biggest questions posed at the time was, how long would Prigozhin last? There is still no official or even unconfirmed news about his whereabouts, though from sources that are official on the Russian side, it is said that he is among those who've been killed. So let's give you some news coming in then on this. The latest on Prigozhin then, he is dead according to a Telegram channel which is affiliated with his Wagner mercenary group. If we can believe this source, we need to confirm. Obviously, it's unconfirmed until we know. But the head of the Wagner Group, according to this Telegram app associated with Wagner, the head of the group, a hero of Russia, it says, true patriot of his motherland, Yevgeny Viktorovich Prigozhin, died as a result of his actions, the actions of traitors to Russia, it says, in a post in the Grey Zone channel. But even in hell, he will be the best. Glory to Russia. These are the words of people who clearly support Prigozhin. You could get, obviously, a different telling of the story from those whose families of soldiers who've been killed in Ukraine, for instance, would have a very different telling of what has happened. Let's go straight to Emmanuel Shaz, because I think we need to get some perspective on this from the Ukrainian side. Emmanuel, good evening to you. The Telegram channel purporting to be linked to Wagner is saying that Prigozhin is dead. The reporting from Russia is supporting that as well. Clearly, I'm not asking you about that, but what I'm asking you is, what is the response where you are? And I understand some news from the Ukraine presidential office.
Absolutely, a reaction from the Chancellor of the Presidential Office, Mikhailo Podolyak, who shared on his social media earlier a message regarding Prigozhin's death. He first said it is worth, I quote, "It is worth waiting for the fog of war to disappear. Meanwhile, it is obvious that Putin doesn't forgive anyone for his own bestial terror." And he ends his rather long message by, if it isn't a Ukrainian tribunal, it will be an FSB bullet, implying that the Russian secret services are responsible for Prigozhin's death. So that's the reaction from the Chancellor of the Presidential Office here in Kyiv. So it's the higher reaction we've got so far. There's also the one of the spokesperson of the Territorial Defense who said earlier to France 24 that if indeed the news is confirmed, well, it will be no loss for freedom. So you can see from those reactions that Yevgeny Prigozhin's death doesn't suscitate any form of sympathy here, but also no surprise at all in the highest spheres of the state, but also no sympathy from the population. The Ukrainians have suffered greatly at the hands of Wagner's mercenaries, not least in Bakhmut, where that Wagner mercenaries actually managed to capture 4 Russian forces, and the Ukrainian army suffered very heavy losses there in Bakhmut, and they're still trying to recapture this city in eastern Ukraine. So no sympathy there. And I'd also like to bring to your attention this poll that was launched a bit earlier by the state-affiliated media United 24 here in Ukraine, which showed that 2/3 of Ukrainian people believe that this was an action of Russian intelligence. They don't believe it was an accident. They do not believe Ukrainian secret services got rid of Yevgeny Prigozhin. They believe that Russian intelligence is responsible if indeed Yevgeny Prigozhin died today.
Indeed, that point of view shared also by the US President Joe Biden, Emmanuel, as we were discussing a little earlier. Remind people for us, if you will, about the scale of what has gone on in eastern Ukraine. You've mentioned Bakhmut, of course, which has been basically flattened primarily by Wagner's mercenaries steaming into that city. There have been atrocities committed. There have been war crimes committed, which remain to be investigated, of course, but nonetheless, the evidence is all stacking up. And Yevgeny Prigozhin very much at the center of it all, and his mercenaries alongside him.
Absolutely, and it's something that Yevgeny Prigozhin made no secret of time and again while he was filming himself here in Ukraine and sharing those videos on his channels, Telegram channels and other social media. He was actually boasting about the cruelty of his men. He was clearly part of the Russian propaganda calling Ukrainians fascists or Nazis and the like. So he was not denying that this was a genocidal war that was going on, and that the goal of his mercenaries was to terrorize the population and not just fight against the regular army, the Ukrainian forces, but also commit atrocities wherever they went. And indeed, the Wagner mercenaries did spread terror among the Ukrainian population. So not just in the east, but also everywhere they went since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So once again, Yevgeny Prigozhin will certainly not be missed here in Ukraine. He's a figure that has been really despised, hated even by the population. And even if Ukrainians actually were quite cheering when they were quite happy when they saw that Prigozhin was leading a rebellion against the Kremlin, they weren't happy because it was Prigozhin. They have no respect for the man or for the head of the Wagner Group, given his record here in Ukraine. But they were hoping that this rebellion would disrupt the Kremlin enough, would disrupt Russia's inner politics enough for Ukraine to be able to benefit from it and perhaps to see an end of the hostilities here on the ground. Now, it didn't happen, but as soon as Prigozhin ended this rebellion, Ukrainians were left with no doubt that his days were counted. This is something that the head of Ukrainian intelligence said back in June. On June 30th, Kirill Budanov said that Yevgeny Prigozhin was now a target of the FSB, and 2/3 of Ukrainians tonight believe that this is exactly what happened, that Yevgeny Prigozhin was eliminated by Russian intelligence.
Indeed, and that point of view shared, I think, by US President Joe Biden, among others. Emmanuel, for now, thank you very much indeed. Emmanuel Shaz there, our correspondent in Kyiv at Maidan Square. Thank you very much for joining us, Emmanuel. Just to remind you, if you're joining us and the news has evaded you so far, the Russian mercenary chief Yevgeny Prigozhin dead. Further confirmation coming from a Telegram channel affiliated with the Wagner mercenary group. The word has come from the Civil Aviation Authority in Russia that Prigozhin and another Wagner commander, Dmitry Utkin, were on board the aircraft that crashed north of Moscow. No survivors is what we are told. Let's get more reaction and analysis and bring in Tatiana Ogakova, a journalist at Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Tatiana, thank you very much for being with us. Your reaction, if indeed it is true that Yevgeny Prigozhin is dead?
Well, there's a lot of confusion about this news because it goes too quickly. In a way, we were prepared to such a murder, such an accident, and I would only confirm that most Ukrainians believe that it could not be an accident and it was a planned murder from FSB or from Putin or whatever. We know that that Wagner and its leader, he was weakened after his assault back in June 2023, and in a way we were prepared to such an accident, but still we are quite astonished by the reaction and by the confirmation, which goes a little bit too fast, because 3 minutes after the accident, Russian media were stating that Prigozhin was dead, and then now these Telegram channels are talking about the fact that their bodies are already identified, which goes a little bit too fast. So in a way, it also seems that they try to make us believe that Prigozhin is really dead. So we still see how it goes, just to be sure that this is true. But in a way, Prigozhin for Ukrainians it's a criminal, and there is no empathy for him, and no just he was important in this combat with Putin party for a couple of months, because in a way it also shows the weakness of Russian political system, because the private army of Wagner was challenging official army, and it was important for us, for Ukrainian army, because the time they quarrel between them, they forget, if you can say so, forget about Ukrainians. So this was important, and now we will see how the conflict goes on.
Indeed, it's been confirmed from Russian aviation sources that Prigozhin was on board the aircraft. So basically, I think now we're getting confirmation that Prigozhin is actually dead, though we need to obviously take this with a little bit of caution, because these things often can be slightly misinterpreted. But we're working on the premise that Prigozhin is dead, waiting for full confirmation. But what we do know is the extent of the damage that the Wagner mercenaries, led by Prigozhin, carried out in Ukraine. And the extent of that, and obviously you've witnessed this firsthand, the extent of that must be something that will make you feel physically sick thinking about it. But obviously, the man responsible now, it seems, dead. I can imagine, though, from your perspective, there's no joy or rejoicing in that, because basically you still have the problem there on your hand, because Putin is still carrying on with this invasion and carrying on with his project.
Yes, exactly. So the Russian regular army is still on occupying Ukrainian land. And yes, indeed, Wagner, for last couple of months, he was maybe the most effective group, because we've all witnessed what happened in Bakhmut in times when Russian regular army was already incapable to progress. But Wagner Group did its best by sacrificing thousands and dozens of thousands of soldiers, trying to get these cities, and they succeeded regardless the price they paid to do so. They were effective, they were extremely cruel, extremely aggressive, and without any pity for their own men. And now, yes, indeed, it doesn't change a lot of things on the ground, because in Bakhmut, specifically, Russian regular army is already there starting from June 2023. So Wagner Group was not so much present on the Ukrainian land for a couple of months already. We know that Wagner Group was displaced or delocalized, I don't know how to name it, to Belarus after this Lukashenko invitation. So there were no more playing an important role on the ground and what's really happening in combat zone right now. But yes, for sure it will change a lot of things inside Russia. And what is really important for us Ukrainians, is to see if this murder would weaken Russian political system, or otherwise another option is still possible, that Putin is trying to eliminate Wagner to become even stronger in a way, to control more military his country, and it could be negative also for Ukraine. So at that very moment, both options are possible. So that's why we would better not speculate, but observe very, very in detail what will happen next.
Tatiana Ogakova of the Ukraine Crisis Media Centre, thank you very much indeed for sharing your thoughts with us here on France 24. We're getting confirmation via various sources that Prigozhin was on that flight which crashed. We'll bring you more, of course, as we get it, concrete information, of course, as we can confirm it for you. For more news, stay with us here on France 24.
Why does love, the absence of love, the end of love, the need for love, result in so much violence?
I had read it and loved it, and then when I heard Sarah was directing it, I emailed her kind of incessantly.
And we could not endure any more violence.
Today on Encore, the story of an isolated religious community battered by sexual abuse.
I wasn't like shocked by it. Isn't that horrible?
No, I wasn't shocked by it either.
Women Talking stars Rooney Mara, Claire Foy, Jessie Buckley and Frances McDormand, amongst others.
It's a New York Times article, isn't it, that was written about it. When you read it, it's terrible. But then what's extraordinary is Miriam's book takes that story and turns it into sort of a fable, and Sarah kind of lent on that even more.
Canadian writer-director Sarah Polley's adaptation of Miriam Tay's 2018 novel is based on a real-life mass rape case in a Mennonite community in Bolivia, where over 4 years men drugged wives, daughters and mothers and raped them, blaming ghosts, demons and hysteria.
We know that we've not imagined these attacks. We know that we are bruised and terrified.
Sarah Polley, hello. Congratulations on the film. The whole audience were glued to their seats when the credits rolled, processing what had happened in the film. It's not the first time you've adapted Canadian authors' stories. What was it about this book that made you want to bring it to the screen and make your first film in a decade?
I fell in love with this book when I read it. I thought the questions were so complex and nuanced, and this debate between these women was so alive and fruitful. And I just was so excited by the idea of finding the best actors I possibly could to have this debate, because I think what it is really is this radical act of democracy, this sense of what does it mean for people to sit in a room who don't agree with each other and have to come to some kind of consensus to move forward. And the whole experiment of that just really riveted me.
We were given 2 days to forgive the attackers before they returned. We hardly knew how to read or to write, but that day, we learned how to vote.
Do nothing.
Stay and fight.
Leave.
They're debating whether they should stay and fight, stay and do nothing, or whether they should leave. And all of those three decisions are huge. They can seem like quite small, like, oh, just get up and go. But it's like they're massive, massive decisions these women are trying to make. And they've got the responsibility for the entire colony of deciding. And that's a big thing. And they've got to do a lot of talking about it. If we do not forgive these men, we forfeit our place in heaven.
Surely there must be something worth living for in this life, not only the next. We cannot forgive because we are forced to.
You did gather some incredible actors. Frances McDormand has a small role in the film as well as producing it, and the cast includes Claire Foy. Her character is full of rage and wants revenge, while Jessie Buckley's character is more ambivalent. Did you always know who was going to play which role?
I didn't. I felt like it was kind of like putting together a theater company and then figuring out where people fit in relation to each other. So I've imagined all those actors in different roles than they played, and it's where we eventually came to, both in terms of how that would play with the other actors, but also in terms of what each actor was really drawn to. So Claire was very drawn to Salome, even though I first met her for Salome. Or for Ona, Rooney Mara was very drawn to Ona, and I think I first met her for Marieke. So everybody kind of shifted around, and it was like just creating this organism and figuring out how people would work together.
What if the men who are in prison are not guilty?
Mother.
Oh, child.
Why are you asking if
Jude,
they're...
shush.
We caught one of them. I saw him.
But only one. Yes, only one, but he named the others.
But what if he was lying? There's a lot of fear in her. I think she's learned to survive through fear by just kind of battening down the hatches, and it was really hard to play her. She kind of broke me apart. You can laugh all you like, Salome, but we will be forced to leave the colony if we don't forgive the men. How will Lord, when he arrives, find the women if we aren't in the colony?
Jesus is able to return to life, live for thousands of years, and then drop down to earth from heaven to scoop up his supporters. Surely he'd also be able to locate a few women who left our colony. Let's stay on track. All right, I'll stay on track. I cannot forgive them.
She has such a huge amount of anger, and it is very righteous. It's coming from a place where she is justifiably angry, but also that her anger is a protection against something else, which is accepting what has happened to herself, her family, her child, and the women in general, and the position they've been put in.
One of the crucial decisions you made, and that you've talked a lot about, is not to show the rape scenes. The film is about how they process the aftermath. Why this choice?
Felt unimportant to me to see the details of the rapes. I think what was very important is the moment after. So we do show the moment after the assaults. That moment where the brain is chaos and it's very difficult to capture the details of what's happened into memory. And that felt important in terms of their experience moving forward, but ultimately the film was about them finding a way forward together and moving in community towards some kind of healing, not about the horror of the assaults themselves. So we don't shy away from talking about it, but I also think when you show sexual assault on screen, it can so easily go sideways, whether you intend it to or not. I think it can so easily become somehow fetishized or sensationalized, and it's very rarely additive, I think. So I can't think of many examples where I think it was necessary to show it on screen. So I'm just, in general, didn't feel drawn to do that anyway.
In terms of the material itself, it is a heavy subject. Sexual abuse survivors coming together. You had a therapist on set. What was the mood like?
We did our absolute best to make it feel like a healthy working environment, and that meant a lot of laughter and a lot of joy. We had shorter working hours than usual in North America. It's probably very normal here, but in North America it was very short working hours.
Talk about that a minute, because that was a big decision that you made as a mum of 3 young children. You decided that you weren't going to do the usual 16-hour days.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I just wouldn't have directed a film again until my kids were a lot older if I'd had to work the regular sort of North American film set hours. So that was a sort of boundary I put up really early, and I had really great support from Frances McDormand and Dee Dee Gardner, the producers, in supporting that and creating this different kind of environment. And then we had Laurie Haskell, this amazing therapist on set, who was available to the crew and the cast at any point. She could be phoned. She was there for the more difficult scenes, and that really helped as well. And we had a rule that anytime anyone needed a break, they just took it, that we would not have this sort of emergency room mentality that can happen on film sets.
We had to literally hold each other up on and off set, and also laugh and, you know, keep it light and kind of just be with each other. And every single woman and Ben in that room, we all had each other's back.
It was tough. Like, there were some really tough, long, hard, brutal, technically difficult days, but we just got through it together. And I don't think I'll ever have an experience like it again.
One of the big questions in the film is, should we forgive? You've written about your own experiences of abuse and trauma. Have you come to your own conclusion about that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about forgiveness is it's not necessarily an end point or a destination. I think it can come and go. So I think for the most part, I do live in a state of basic forgiveness. I don't feel like I carry along a lot of active anger and grief. I think I've worked through a lot of that I've had a lot of decades to work through that. and do therapy and meditation and all of the things. I do think that I'm in a general state of forgiveness, but I don't think that that can be relied upon to stay stagnant. And I also don't think it needs to be an end goal for everybody. I mean, I think that's where I am in my life, and that's what I find helpful.
It's both men and women who need to unlearn things so they can learn something new.
Yeah, it's not about blame.
No.
Or retribution.
Our choice will be your future.
In your book that came out last year, Run Towards the Danger, you write about being in unsafe environments on set when you were a child actress. How does that experience affect the way that you interact with your own actors?
I think that I'm just very interested in figuring out all the ways that there can be the presence of care on a film set, because I think we've become so accustomed to this idea that great art can't be made without a lot of difficulty and tumult and torture for everybody involved. And so I think just figuring out how to debunk that in a real way, practically on set every day, becomes a real focus for me. So how do we put the experience of making this film, how do we make it a priority alongside making a film that we're proud of? Like, how do we make that intrinsic to what our intentions are?
She's not like a dictator. She's a real enabler and a truth sayer, and somebody who can hold all those huge energies and points of view. Is a very, very special person, and I'm forever grateful that I've had this chance to work with her in my life.
I know your children were on the set at one point and they're interested in acting. What would you say to them if they wanted to become child actors?
I think we've decided as a society that kids shouldn't work, and I find it always so odd that we make an exception for the film industry, which is probably one of the last places I would think kids would be happy and healthy and taken care of. So in my mind, I'm very happy to support them doing school stuff or acting clubs or theater programs that are designed in the best interest of kids. But in terms of a professional environment, I would highly discourage it.
Now, you've said that working with Catherine Bigelow 2 decades ago opened your eyes to how challenging it was for women directors in the industry. Do you think things have changed now?
I think things have certainly changed somewhat. So I think that the cultural conversation that's happened in the last several years has helped. For sure, having had 10 years off being a filmmaker and coming back, I feel like some of the obstacles have been removed, but certainly not all of them. And there's certainly a very long way to go.
So you're not going to wait another 10 years to make another film?
I hope not. I mean, I don't want to make films just for the sake of making films. So if I feel as urgent about a film as I did about this one, I'll absolutely make one. But I think I have to have that same sense of urgency to make one.
Sarah Polley,
thank you so much. Nice to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How would you feel if in your entire life it never mattered what you thought? When we've liberated ourselves, we will have to ask ourselves who we are.
They observe. They contact us. They report, film, photograph. They are the voice of the voiceless. Your eyes in the far-flung reaches of the world. The Observers, a network of 5,000 committed citizens working with France 24.
One of our observers in Côte d'Ivoire, Gaspard.
Amateur footage and testimonials checked by our journalists and broadcast weekly on The Observers, on France 24 and observers.france24.com.
Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith.
All the latest in politics, economics and the arts in Africa on France 24. Our journalists are in every region, every country, to report on the emergence of a continent of unparalleled riches. Bringing you Africa's stories on France 24.
Good, thanks for joining us. See you again. Take care.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Reports in Russia say Yevgeny Prigozhin was on board a jet that crashed north of Moscow with no survivors. The head of the Wagner mercenary group was listed as a passenger on the flight between Russia's capital and St. Petersburg. Prigozhin led the mutiny against Putin in June. Western security services say the crash bears the hallmarks of a Russian Secret Service hit. Thank you for joining us for this breaking news on the situation in Russia regarding Yevgeny Prigozhin. Reports are coming out of Russia say that the head of the Wagner mercenary group was on board an aircraft that crashed, killing all on board. The flight was a business jet. 10 people are reported dead. 8 bodies have been found at the scene of the crash. Prigozhin's name was on the passenger list of the flight, according to Russia's media, quoting Russian Civil Aviation Authority. Prigozhin led the rebellion against Vladimir Putin in June when his mercenaries marched on Moscow. There had been long-standing rows over the supply of arms, ammunition and personnel, which put Prigozhin more and more at odds with the Russian military establishment. His online outbursts against the system, often aggressive and foul-mouthed, included criticism of his supposed friend and ally Vladimir Putin. Indeed, their relationship in business-wise went back to the days when Putin was mayor of St. Petersburg. Even though the mutiny was over quickly, it sent shockwaves through the Kremlin and made Vladimir Putin look weak. And tonight, many are seeing this crash not as an accident, but as a revenge hit by the Russian FSB, the secret services. So, various sources saying that Prigozhin was on board that plane and there were no survivors. Even a Telegram channel close to the Wagner Group is saying that he is dead. Let's go to Kyiv for reaction from that part of the story, because obviously the Wagner Group was very much central to what has been going on in the east of Ukraine, and particularly around the town of Bakhmut, which has been razed over a year of intense fighting there. Emmanuel Shaz has covered much of that for us, and she joins us now live from Kyiv. Emmanuel, good evening to you. I understand you have reaction from the presidential office there in Kyiv.
We do have reactions from Mihailo Podolyak, his advisor to the presidential office, and he communicated on his social media earlier to say about Prigozhin, and I'm quoting him, "It is worth waiting for the fog of war to disappear. Meanwhile, it is obvious that Putin does not forgive anyone for his own bestial terror." And he finishes his rather long address on his social media by saying, if it isn't a Ukrainian tribunal, well, it will be an FSB bullet. He is referring to the widespread belief here in Kyiv that the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin, if indeed confirmed, would have been the work of Russian intelligence. And in doing so, he's actually following the steps of Ukraine's head of intelligence, Kirill Budanov, who said back in June, who had said that Prigozhin's head was actually wanted by the FSB, by Russian intelligence, after the Wagner mercenary head had launched a rebellion against the Kremlin. And here in Ukraine, two-thirds of the population think that this is the work of Russian intelligence. They do not believe it was an accident. They do not believe it was a mechanical failure or even the work of Ukrainian intelligence. They do believe that Moscow, that the Kremlin punished Yevgeny Prigozhin for his rebellion against the Kremlin back in June.
Emmanuel Shaz in Kyiv, thank you very much indeed. And as Manuel was saying there, the opinion in Kyiv very much shared by US President Joe Biden, who says that he's not surprised by the news of Prigozhin's death. There is not that much that happens in Russia, he says, that Putin is not behind. We heard earlier from David Smith, our correspondent, joining us from Washington. David is, of course, the bureau chief of the Guardian newspaper there in the US Capitol.
In recent weeks, we heard Joe Biden making a sort of tongue-in-cheek comment about, if I was Prigozhin, I'd be checking my menu and what I eat. Bill Burns, the head of the CIA, made a similar comment as well at a security forum recently. So I think with millions of other people, the US government certainly had a suspicion that Prigozhin might become a target for Vladimir Putin. And yes, just in the last hour or two, Joe Biden, who's on holiday in Nevada, was asked specifically about what has happened and said about comments, confirming he doesn't actually know himself. Of course, confirmation of this, but would not be surprised, as you say, that nothing really happens in Russia without Vladimir Putin being behind it. So I think right now the White House is obviously watching this closely, and would not at all be surprised if it turns out Vladimir Putin's hand is in this, given so many incidents in the past when Putin's enemies have met with their demise.
Indeed, there is a pattern. We've been discussing that in the studio here, David. But just talking about the US angle again, I mean, the US intelligence was very much ahead of the curve in terms of predicting the invasion back in February last year when that happened. Do you get any whispers from intelligence sources about what might have happened here with Prigozhin, about what might happen next, about how things could develop in Moscow and beyond?
I think hard to say, and you're absolutely right. The US has often been ahead of the game on this. I was just at a press conference earlier where the Democrats were reminding us that US intelligence predicted the Russian invasion even when President Zelensky of Ukraine was still saying it was not going to happen. So I would not at all be surprised if US intelligence sort of foresaw something like this happening. We're hearing in American media, former intelligence directors and figures in that establishment now speculating that, of course, this is Putin trying to reassert control, trying to send a very direct message that any rebellion against him will be quelled. But also what those experts are saying, and what I suspect the current US intelligence community is watching closely, is now the morale of Russian forces. Remember, Prigozhin and the Wagner Group were fighting alongside the conventional Russian army in Ukraine. That has been a steep struggle, and now to see what has happened to the Wagner Group could be a blow to morale and an army that, in many cases, does not want to be there anyway. Developments of recent months suggest that what could appear like a stalemate that's not going anywhere, get sudden developments and things can change very quickly. So I think the US remains braced for that, and in the meantime determined to not be the one to blink first, determined to keep on pumping security assistance to Ukraine.
David Smith, the Washington bureau chief of the Guardian newspaper, who joined us a little earlier to give us the reaction in the US regarding the death, as it's been reported from Russia, of Yevgeny Prigozhin, head of the Wagner Group, who was on board an aircraft that crashed in between Moscow and St. Petersburg. Some reaction coming from the opposition in Belarus. Prigozhin, a murderer who won't be missed. The CIA director, Bill Burns, predicted last month that Wagner mercenary leader Prigozhin probably hadn't seen the last of Putin's wrath after the warlord staged that failed coup against the Kremlin.
Putin is someone who generally thinks that revenge is a dish best served cold. So he's going to try to settle the situation to the extent he can. But again, in my experience, Putin is the ultimate apostle of payback. So I would be surprised if Prigozhin escapes further retribution for this. So in that sense, the president's right. If I were Prigozhin, I wouldn't fire my food taster.
So the reaction there from the United States. Russian aviation agency has said that Prigozhin was on board the aircraft that crashed, leaving no survivors. The presumption, and it is a presumption because we've not had it 100% confirmed, in spite of what people are saying, the noise going round this story. It's not 100% confirmed that Prigozhin is dead, though the likelihood is that the head of the Wagner mercenaries was killed on that flight. Nick Holdsworth is our former correspondent in Moscow. He joined us earlier to talk about the implications beyond this story.
There's been a catastrophic crash there. They may only have found 8 bodies yet. You can see from those images of how that jet has been burning up on the ground. Possibly there are more bodies to be found. My initial reaction on hearing this news was, well, that kind of figures that if Prigozhin was on that flight, he was often flying between Moscow and St. Petersburg. He was based in St. Petersburg. If you remember, shortly after the aborted coup in June, there were reports of Prigozhin flying between Moscow and St. Petersburg. Subsequently, he went to Belarus as part of a deal brokered by the Belarusian President Lukashenko. And then he was seen moving around in Russia at various state-sponsored events in St. Petersburg. A conference last month, for example, appeared to have the freedom of movement, even though he had been accused of treason by Putin and said that an investigation would be carried out and he would be held accountable. My initial reaction was that if this is not an accident, and again, this is speculation, but if this is not an accident, it kind of figures, because Putin does not forgive traitors easily. And we've seen this time after time. People have crossed him, going way back to the KGB officer Alexander Litvinenko, who died in London after being poisoned with polonium back in about 10, 15 years ago. We've seen time after time that Putin does eventually catch up with his critics. It's also interesting that this accident or this incident happened today, on the very day that General Surovikin, also known as General Armageddon, who was the head of the aerospace forces in Russia, who was implicated in that aborted so-called coup a couple of months ago that Prigozhin's Wagner forces led between Rostov-na-Don and Moscow. It's been reported that that general, Surovikin, has been dismissed as head of the Russian aerospace forces. Now, it's widely rumored that he had been implicated in that coup attempt and that he's been under house arrest since. We don't really know what the charges are against that general, but we do know that the Russian authorities seem to be acting against some of the principal actors in that aborted coup, if indeed this crash today was more than just an accident. The weather conditions, cloudy, Russian aviation subject to not very thorough checks perhaps these days, a shortage of materials, of replacements for Western-made aircraft because of the sanctions. But all the same, a passenger manifest that says here are 7 passengers and 3 crew, one of whom is named as Yevgeny Prigozhin, and sources, both on the official side, saying that this is so that his name was on the manifest, as Doug has just explained, and sources close to Prigozhin saying they can't get hold of him. It's possible that Prigozhin has died in what on the face of it could be an accident, but it could be something more sinister than that too.
Nick Holdsworth there. Let's just remind you of the story, the main story, the breaking news coming out of Russia. Reports there from Russia that the Wagner mercenary commander Yevgeny Prigozhin was on board an aircraft that crashed, killing all on board. The flight was a business jet. 10 people are reported dead. 8 bodies have been found at the scene of the crash. Prigozhin's name was on the passenger list of the flight, according to Russian media, quoting the Russian Civil Aviation Authority. Prigozhin, of course, led the rebellion against Vladimir Putin in June when his mercenaries marched on Moscow. There have been long-standing rows over the supply of arms, ammunition and personnel, which put Prigozhin more and more at odds with Russia's military establishment. And his online outbursts, often foul-mouthed and very aggressive against the system, often included criticism of Putin. Even though the mutiny was quickly over, it sent shockwaves through the Kremlin and made Putin look weak. And tonight, many are seeing this crash not as an accident, but as a revenge hit by the Russian FSB. For more news, stay with us. You're watching France 24.
1966, an unbelievable story that's been largely forgotten. Above the village of Palomares in Spain, two US Air Force planes collide. One of them is a nuclear bomber. On board, 4 atomic bombs. None are armed and they do not explode. But 2 are cracked open on impact with the ground, creating a plutonium leak, posing a risk to health and threatening the ecosystem. While the 3rd bomb remains intact, the missing 4th bomb is found at sea after a tense 89-day search. Hear the moving testimonies of locals in search of answers and experts denouncing the lack of transparency on the part of the government and the US military. Palomares Revisited on France 24 and France24.com. France 24, your economy explained.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, the Russian warlord who'd courted African nations turning away from their traditional colonial allies is reported dead. Yevgeny Prigozhin's name is on the passenger list of a plane that crashes near Moscow. Also, a chaotic day at the polls in Zimbabwe leads opposition leader Nelson Chamisa to cry foul, alleging voter suppression as he goes up against incumbent Emerson Mnangagwa. And the BRICS Club is willing to build itself up. The group of emerging economies meeting at the key summit in Johannesburg agrees to expand its numbers as it pursues greater geopolitical clout. But first, the Russian mercenary group Wagner has confirmed the death of its leader Yevgeny Prigozhin in a plane crash near Moscow. Thousands of Wagner troops operate in several countries across Africa, including Central African Republic, Libya, Sudan, and Mali. Even the recent junta in Niger may have been putting out feelers. Now, Wagner had been an unofficial extension of the Kremlin's reach, but that relationship was complicated by an uprising against Russian President Vladimir Putin in June. Now, Prigozhin is dead. Dr. Fola Aina from the security think tank The Royal United Services tells me more about what Prigozhin's end means for Wagner's operations in Africa.
Thank you very much for having me. First of all, I think it doesn't make so much of a difference because in many ways Wagner has been able to establish its presence across the region, the continent. So I feel basically that what's going to happen right now is simply to get a replacement for him, and then the group's basically its operations continues basically in Africa uninterrupted.
And post-uprising, can the African influence of the Kremlin and that of Wagner still really be seen as one and the same? Is this likely to change much when it comes to Putin's interactions with Africa?
Again, so I think we shouldn't expect so much to change with regards to this interaction with Africa. First and foremost is because Russia has a very keen interest in Africa right now. And with what's been happening with the West and the region or on the continent, there's a keen need for Russia to try to fill in the policing gap, that has been created as a result of the West's declining influence across the African continent. So if at all anything, I would say that would be seeing more of an inroad by Russia across the region, and whether or not Russia will be using Wagner Group to achieve this would be much to be desired or much to be seen, basically, for Russia. But it's certain that they would definitely continue to make this inroads across the continent, and in many ways also try to assure, that their interest in Africa is guaranteed and secured.
And when it comes to Wagner itself, just give us a bit of a sense of what its footprint looks like on the continent at the moment.
So yes, Wagner has been very much entrenched in Africa, and they've been making lots of plans to try to expand this reach. So currently they have a presence in Mali, in the Central African Republic, also in Burkina Faso, and like you rightly mentioned, also there were already plans to get involved in Niger, considering the recent developments in that country. But now I think what they'll be trying to do is to go ahead with these penetration into the African continent and expand upon some of the gains they've already made on the continent, irrespective of the fact that their leader has passed on.
Well, Dr. Fola Aina there speaking to me a little earlier on. Now, in other news, Zimbabwe's main opposition leader has accused incumbent President Emmerson Mnangagwa's government of vote rigging after huge delays at polling booths during Wednesday's high-stakes elections. Voting stations were still being opened in some places as others closed for the day. Shirley Sitbin tells us more.
These voters arrived to their polling stations hours before they were due to open, but they discovered that their ballots had not been printed. Some voters' names were also missing from the official registers.
But I'm going to sleep here. I'm not going home. Home is going to come here because I want to cast my vote. My children are suffering. No employment, no education. We cannot afford it.
Is it professional? So at the end, we as the citizens of Zimbabwe, we are not going to trust the result which is going to come out, especially if it's favoring the incumbent.
The incumbent president, 80-year-old Emmerson Mnangagwa, is facing once again Nelson Chamisa, 45, from the Citizens Coalition for Change. Chamisa said voting delays were a deliberate attempt to alter results.
It's clear and a deliberate plot. They are targeting urban areas. They've made sure that there are no ballots for the councillors. There are no ballots for other candidates.
NGOs have accused authorities of blocking opposition rallies and campaigns. Asked if he had a message for the nation, President Mnangagwa replied,
Peace and quietness.
Emmerson Mnangagwa hailed the high turnout among young voters.
Well, Nyasha Chingono is in Harare, and he tells me more about whether the chaos of the voting day could have been anticipated.
Thank you so much for having me. I think the writing was on the wall that ZEC was not ready to hold this election. Before, about 2 weeks ago, it was taken to court by the main opposition party for 3 reasons: that it had not revealed who had printed the ballot papers. Number 2, how many ballot papers had been printed, and also number 3, that were they ready to disperse these. So the writing was on the wall that the Electoral Commission was not prepared to run this election. We saw it today. Many people right now are still voting as late as 9 p.m. Voting in some police stations started as late as 7 p.m. So it's actually a worrying sight. It's the first of its kind in this country that the Electoral Commission has failed to provide the basic requirements of running a credible election.
And Nyasha, Nelson Chamisa is trying to break ZANU-PF's grip on power. Mnangagwa is trying to run for a second term. What are the overall stakes here?
For the incumbent, this election and its credibility is very important for the reason that Zimbabwe is owing nearly 18 billion to the multilateral institutions. And as part of the conditions that for debt resolution to take place, Zimbabwe is supposed to hold a free, fair and credible election. So he cannot afford to let this slip through his hands. He has to make sure that this election is run fairly. And also, this is his second and last term. He needs to get this vote so that he can also instill confidence in the people that put him into power back in 2017. For Nelson Chamisa, it's a do or die for him. if he does not win this election, it means that another 5 years of Zimbabwe under ZANU-PF rule, which will extend it to about 48 years in power. So it's something that is the ball is in the two men's court that they need to make sure that they win this election for the generality of Zimbabwe, so that life can change for the poor person on the street.
Nyasha Chingono there for us in Harare. Now, leaders of the group of emerging economies known as BRICS, made up of Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, have agreed to expand their membership. Calls to enlarge the BRICS have dominated conversations at a summit in Johannesburg. Some of its members would like to boost its weight as a geopolitical counterbalance to the West. Erin Bates with more.
AU Chairperson Azali Assoumani, as well as UN Secretary General António Guterres, are among delegates at the 15th BRICS Summit held here in Johannesburg, South Africa, on the African continent for the first time. Of course, Assoumani's presence is important because of the appetite amongst African countries, among them Zimbabwe. We've also heard reports about Algeria and the Democratic Republic of Congo to join the BRICS bloc. Of course, Guterres' press conference, which is set to take place after two meetings he's been invited to attend on Thursday, the 24th of August, will be important because there's been so much discussion about putting a balance to the prevailing world order. In fact, during the addresses from the 5 heads of state on Wednesday afternoon, we heard commentary on the need for bodies like the UN Security Council to have stronger African representation and indeed permanent representation. You could say that the sirens have been sounding from delegates here at the 15th BRICS Summit in terms of expanding membership. There's consensus from leaders on that score. The question now is what will be the criterion and indeed the impact of growing the group.
Erin Bates there for us in Johannesburg. That is, though, where we'll have to leave it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks for joining us. Do stay with us, though. More coming up. Take care.
2016 Ivory Coast. In Grand-Bassam, an attack by Al-Qaeda ended in a massacre.
Ça courait, ça criait, on entendait des coups de feu.
A population traumatized. Tourism in freefall. For the government, there was only one answer: a special security force. For the people of Grand-Bassam, they want justice and are looking to the future.
C'est une victoire parce qu'on a vu des coupables.
Grand-Bassam Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.
your programme for the latest sports news.
France 24 keeps you up to date with all the latest from the world of sport. All the action, all the results, all the emotion.
Sports on France 24 and France24.com.